Hello. On behalf of the Oregon Technology Access Program, I'm pleased to welcome you to the Assistive Technology and Secondary Transition webinar series with our renowned guest, Gail Bowser. Today, part one, we'll be talking about an overview of assistive technology and post-secondary transition. In our future sessions, part two, we will be looking at quiet post-secondary, that's quality indicators in assistive technology, post-secondary student self-evaluation matrix for students who are planning on higher ed after high school. In part three, we'll be looking at independent employment in assistive technology. So without further ado, I am pleased to bring to you Gail Bowser. Gail, take it away.
Do a sort of an overview of transition, and particularly transition and assistive technology. How to coordinate with adult services for students who are graduating. And Lanita says, I've joined with my team. That's wonderful. Okay, so what I want to do, well, let's get started. One of the reasons I asked this question is that we are doing 3 webinars, so that always gives me a chance to adjust content to meet the needs of the group. And it sounds to me like many of you at this point in time are just looking for some general information. I see somebody says, I want to be able to help my son, so we have at least one parent on the call, and that's wonderful. Thank you for joining us. And again, all of you, feel free to interrupt anytime and ask questions. One of the things I love about the Zoom platform is that we really can do that. We can have some serious interaction with each other and some rousing conversations if we want to. As Deb mentioned to you, the first of these webinars is sort of an overview of assistive technology and the ways it fits into transition. So I want to recommend to you, if you do have a person in mind who's in that process of transitioning from school to adult life and adult services, that's really the best way to use this information, is to take the big picture concepts that we're going to talk about today and see in your own brain how they apply to that individual. I will say that in this webinar particularly, we're not going to talk about technology devices very much. In the other two, we'll mention some applications as some assistive technology applications as examples of ways to integrate assistive technology into post-secondary educational environments and then into work environments. But this one, we're going to talk about some big picture concepts. And one of the reasons we do that is because they are so crucial, and if we really hope to have successful transitions from high school to adult life, we really need to start some work early on to make sure that kids are able to have continuity of their ATUs over time. So this is the big picture webinar, and then we'll have 2 more that are a little bit more specific. And in all of these, we will be showing you some pretty new information along with some concepts that we've been talking about in the field of assistive technology for quite some time. So it'll be a mix of both and probably, I hope, new and useful information for each of you. I wanted to give you my perspective on assistive technology and transition because I have been lucky enough to be a part of transition for people who use assistive technology in a variety of different ways. First of all, I was a high school teacher for some time, so I was working directly with students who were moving from high school to community settings. I am a parent. I was an education specialist and also an assistive technology specialist for the state of Oregon. But the place where I really feel like I earned my stripes and got really involved in the work of assistive technology and transition was that when I became the coordinator of the Oregon Technology Access Program, so people like to say I was the first Deb, probably not the best Deb, but the first Deb, or the first coordinator of OTAP. One of the things that happened for us was as we were building that program, we also knew some individuals, there are two of them here in this picture, who were transitioning from high school to community settings. And there was a great deal of interest in the late 80s and early 90s on transition and supported employment. So these were folks with significant disabilities, and we really wanted to know whether or not they could be successful in a non-segregated work environment, even in our little town of Roseburg, Oregon. So we worked with a couple adult service agencies, with developmental disability services and vocational rehabilitation, and we created supported employment opportunities for 3 individuals, and then that made me their work supervisor and their employer. They had personal care assistant who worked with all 3 of them because all of them needed some level of personal care. But we, I learned so much about the realities of supported employment and integrated employment for people with disabilities in that setting. And it's the place, I think, where I really got my passion for this work and this topic. I also helped start the first group home agency in Douglas County and have been a transition advocate for years and years now. So that's my credential. I also give you this list because I really want to say to you that it's very important to think about your own perspectives as you think about transition and assistive technology. So I will encourage you over and over again in this series of webinars to put yourself in the place of the agency or the person who is in that transition, who's involved in that transition. Not just the setting where you sit every single day and encourage people to use assistive technology and to make those transitions, but to think of yourselves in some of the other roles that might be involved in a transition for people who use assistive technology. The first thing we need to do if we're going to talk about this topic in a big picture way is to talk about some of the national policy and rules that are developing in the area of transition right now. And I have to tell you that I cannot remember a time other than the late 80s and early 90s when transition was first included in IDEA. I can't remember a time when there's been as much scrutiny and as much excitement about the possibilities of transition for people who use assistive technology, and also about integration of people with both high incidence disabilities, milder academic disabilities, and significant disabilities into everyday workplace routines and environments. We are learning so much, and we are being encouraged at the state level and the federal level to really think about our assistive technology, our transition services in new and different ways. So I want to take a minute to talk about that and some of the national policy and Oregon policy initiatives that are happening. So, because it may explain to some of you who said, wow, our district is really focusing on transition right now. Part of the explanation for that is that there are state and national changes happening that are making an enormous difference in the lives of people with disabilities and have the potential to make even more difference as those initiatives roll out and states begin to implement them. Before we do that, before we talk about some of the new things, it's important to mention that there's an enormous difference between the entitlement services that we have mandated under IDEA and the eligibility services that are available to people with disabilities as they leave the K-12 system and move into the services for adults that are provided in every community in our state and hopefully every community in our country. The big picture summary of those differences is that IDEA, the law that we operate under for assistive technology, but also for the entire special education range of services that are provided, is an entitlement law. Basically it's a civil rights law. And it says that people with students with disabilities who need special education, who need specially designed instruction, are entitled to get that. And that's a bit different than the services that are provided to adults. So let's talk about those differences. An entitlement means that school districts have the requirement to identify kids with disabilities, to determine what their disability is, whether or not they have a disability, to find those kids, assess their needs, and document that what they did and how they are making sure that each child has the specially designed instruction that they need. Now, most of you, I believe, live and breathe that on a daily basis, whether you're a parent or a consumer with a disability or a professional working in the education system. The difference happens when we move to adult services because the philosophy of both our state and federal government is that adults with disabilities need to be treated like adults. So there is no, the law changes from an entitlement law where every single child who has a disability needs to be identified and found, to a law to several laws that talk about here's what it would take for you to be eligible to get the services that you need from an agency like Voc Rehab, from an agency like Department of Human Services, from all Social Security, all the agencies that provide services to people with disabilities. But the main difference is that adults who are wanting those kinds of services have to ask for them. There's no mandate that the Voc Rehab people go out and find all the people in the community with disabilities and ask them if they want help in doing their work. There's no mandate that the agencies that provide supported living services go out and find all the people in the community who might need help in living independently. So in adult services, the individual with the disability decides what they need, and then they have to go and ask for it, so they have to self-refer. And they also have to provide whatever documentation they need, that's needed in order to make sure that they are qualified to receive the services that those agencies get. The reason we talk about this so much is because it is such a major change in the way we think about and do things. And for parents and service providers who are used to the K-12 system, there's often an assumption that the level of support they'll receive in the K-12 setting will continue when the student leaves the leaves high school and moves on to adult services. And that is only true if the individual themselves or a person who has guardianship of that individual and can act for them asks for the services. So it's a very different environment. It's one of the reasons that we see that people who use assistive technology may not have continuity of AT use, may not continue to use their assistive technology as they leave high school in the K-12 system, because they may not have the set of skills required to really understand their own technology, to operate it independently, and to advocate for the things they need in terms of assistive technology. So we're going to talk about that a lot in the context of this webinar. So if you're interested in transition in general, there is a brand new federal guidance document out, and it's called A Transition Guide to Post-Secondary Education and Employment for Children and Youth, Students and Youth with Disabilities. So this is a really brand new, it came out in January. We provided it to you as a handout for today. It's, I gotta tell you, I don't know, 100 pages or something. But it's a great reference guide if you're concerned or interested in particularly this topic of post-secondary education and post-secondary employment, what can be available. And there's parts in this document that talk about the requirements of public schools in making sure that those transitions happen beautifully. There are some reasons that this kind of guidance and this kind of scrutiny are happening right now, and especially in the last year. So let's talk a little bit about what those reasons are. The first one is the National Long-Term Transition Study. I always have to think carefully about that acronym. It's NLTS2. So it was the second long-term transition study that was done by the federal government, and actually it continues to be done by the federal government over time. The initial studies were done in the early 2000s, and they have continued every so often to collect data about the same group of students who were in the study initially. Every state in the country contributed to this study. Every State Department, Office of Special Education, every State Department had to collect data for this study. So it's the only one I know of where the national data was so significant. You see here a chart of some of the initial data that was collected in terms of how are our kids with disabilities doing 2 years or 5 years after they graduated from high school. And you'd see some statistics here. I think the big picture of this is that in all areas, our students with disabilities are less likely to be successful than students in the general population. So they are less likely to be enrolled in post-secondary educational programs of any sort, not just colleges and universities. They're particularly less likely to be enrolled in college. They hold their jobs for shorter periods of time. So you can see the difference. The general population holds their jobs for right out of high school for about 15 months. Students with disabilities, more like 10 months. They're less likely to have checking accounts. They're less likely to have credit cards. They're less likely to be working, and they're more likely, you can see in that starred area, to have quit their job than to leave for any other reason. They're more likely to quit than they are to be laid off. And there was a whole list of things in the study. So there's a whole lot more data about this. And one of the other things that this study does, if you want to delve into it more deeply, is to look at categories of students with disabilities. So in a few minutes, we're going to talk about students with, we're going to talk about self-determination, and which is one of the factors that this National Long-Term Transition Study looked at, was how do kids who have self-determination do as compared to kids who don't have self-determination. And as they analyzed the data, what they saw is that there are categories of people with disabilities who tend to be less likely to have self-determination skills. And if you look at that carefully, you'll see that it tends to be students with significant physical disabilities and students with autism who are less likely to be self-determined. So there's a lot of data in these studies, and they continue, the federal government continues to make this data available and to sort of mine it for information like what you see here and like the information about self-determination, so that we can really have a good picture of what's going on with our students with disabilities. In part as a result of that study, and in part as a result of a Supreme Court case called the Olmsted case, we're seeing a great deal more focus on integration of people with disabilities into particularly employment opportunities. And so here's the Olmsted case. In 1999, the Supreme Court affirmed that the Americans with Disabilities Act had an implied requirement to place people with disabilities in community settings. The Olmsted Act was a class action suit brought by people who were primarily working in sheltered workshops and segregated community living and work settings. The focus of this act was very much on both living and work. So last year, in 2016, President Obama did an interesting thing. He issued a proclamation that directed the Civil Rights Division to develop an effective and nationwide program to enforce the integration mandate of the ADA, which was defined, or better defined, by the Supreme Court in 1999. So you can see it took 17 years to make those kinds of significant changes. And what I want to do now is pull down my slideshow and show you a video that can be found at this link at the bottom of the slide. This is a brief summary of what's happened with Olmsted in the last year or so. Deb has assured me at least a minute ago that you'll be able to hear my video and see this video. So we're just going to take a couple minutes. This is a 17-minute video. We're not going to see the whole thing, but I wanted to introduce you to this topic because it is in large part what is affecting us both nationally and in Oregon in terms of the increased focus on transition.
15 years ago, the Supreme Court handed down its decision in what many have called the Brown versus Board of Education of the disability rights movement. The landmark Olmsted decision determined that individuals with disabilities have a right under the law to receive services in the most integrated setting appropriate. Anything less deprives them of the opportunity to participate fully in their communities and to make their own choices about how to live their lives. Today, as we reflect on how far we've come, let's also rededicate ourselves to the fight to make Olmsted's promise a reality for everyone.
I wonder how I can get out of an institute because I felt like I was doing time for a crime I never commit. You don't make decisions. You don't choose. You have no say. You just do as they tell you to do. And if you didn't do, there are consequences.
Through the end of the 20th century in the United States, individuals with disabilities were often kept hidden from the mainstream of society, confined against their will in large state-run institutions. In the 1970s, there were hundreds of thousands of individuals with disabilities being held in institutions, including those whose names are now infamous: Willowbrook, Pennhurst, Rosewood, and the State Lunatic Hospital at Danvers. Some of these institutions housed thousands of individuals with disabilities in deplorable conditions. Senator Robert Kennedy toured one such institution, Willowbrook, in 1965, and saw the residents of the overcrowded facility, quote, living in filth and dirt, their clothing in rags, in rooms less comfortable and cheerful than the cages in which we put animals in a zoo.
Okay, so there's the rationale. I'm going to pull this forward because, as I said, I didn't want you to, if you are interested in watching this entire video, one of the things you'll see here is that this gentleman was institutionalized for quite a number of years, and he's now out and working independently, living by himself, and actually has a child that he supports. But let's look at some of the other people in this video who are parents of kids with disabilities, since we are education focused at the moment.
Doctors suggested that we put him in a home, in an institution, and I flat out refused. I said no. And they told us all the things that he would never do, and the majority of them he has done. I just feel that if he'd have been put in an institution, he wouldn't be here now. You know, I just don't think he would last in that environment. It's really been a blessing. He's made so many friends, people that actually come to on the days he works to see Justin.
It's neat seeing him out here. I do a lot of work with Special Olympics, and I think it's great to see kids that just want to be part of society and contribute, to be given the opportunity.
Well, working with Justin has been a treat. I've been with Justin for over 6 years now. He's been part of our family. He's been a great inspiration to us. You know, he has a lot of people come in just to see him. It's a kind of a bright spot of my day. I get to see him come in, and I know he's going to be here to greet all of our customers, talk to everybody. And he's helped motivate me in my own personal life with my family.
To imagine him being in a home or an institution where he didn't have the one-on-one with people, where he couldn't do his favorite things like go get in his van and go for a ride when he wanted to, in the front seat, and play the radio going down the road. He likes going to Disney World. There's things that he would never get to do in a different situation.
Okay, so I'm going to stop that there. It's really quite a wonderful video, and one of the things that I wanted to point out to you is that this is a Office of Civil Rights video. It is a focus from the very highest levels of our government on the enforcement of Title II of the ADA. Many of the activities that we see focused on transition come from this Obama proclamation to the Office of Civil Rights. But another thing that's happening in Oregon is that there was an Oregon class action suit, which affected how we look at transition for individuals with disabilities within the state, and it was particularly focused on individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities. So in that class action suit, these are some of the requirements in the settlement, because Oregon basically said to the group of people that were suing the state, you're right, we are isolating people with disabilities both in living and employment opportunities. We have a very extensive service system for people with disabilities. but they are not providing options. So one of the main factors in this Lane and others versus Brown and others is the opportunity for any individual with a disability who is going into employment to request the kind of employment environment that they want to be in. To say, well, it's okay with me to be in a supported employment, in a sheltered workshop, or to say, no, I really want to be in a more integrated community setting. And not that we take away the opportunity for sheltered workshops, but that we give anyone who wants it opportunity to be employed in what I want to call the least restrictive environment. So some of the principles of special education carry over to this lawsuit, and it is very much the result of this lawsuit, which I believe was settled just about a year ago. It was also a 2016 event. And part of the settlement was that the state would provide funding to make all of these other goals possible. So if you are, in fact, working in one of those new transition regional programs, you can thank, in part, you can thank the Lane versus Brown civil action for some of those kinds of activities. The Department of Education recently issued a memo, which I believe we also provided to you as a handout, about supported employment services. If we didn't send it out this time, we will send it out in the next webinar, the webinar that's focused on employment. But the basically what it does is defines for us what the role of public schools is in these transitions. So the primary impact of the Lane class action suit was on agencies like vocational rehabilitation and developmental disabilities services. But the Department of Ed has issued guidance about how the settlement agreement deals with transition services and provides that ODE shall require the transition planning process and provide information about supported employment in integrated settings for students with disabilities. One of the main factors in this guidance is that the department is really encouraging people to start much earlier than age 16 to plan for and begin to think about supported employment and integrated settings. So our Oregon law says that transition planning has to start no later than age 16 because that's what the federal law says. But the Department of Ed recently has really been encouraging people to start even earlier than that. If you're interested in the general topic of transition, here's the web link that will take you to the Oregon Department of Education's transition pages, and there's an enormous amount of information in those transition pages that that will be valuable to you as you think about transition. What we need to do now, though, is to stop focusing on big T transition stuff and begin to drill down to how does this apply to assistive technology. Before we do that, though, I wanted to ask Deb, have there been any questions in the chat box that I need to address? Or to invite anybody who's on the call right now to either type in the chat box or unmute yourself if you have any questions about the federal guidance and state guidance stuff that we've talked about so far. This seems like a good transition point for our transition webinar.
I don't see anything in the chat box at this point.
I have a
Did I hear
question.
somebody say you had a question?
I do. My name is Wink Harner.
Hi, Wayne.
Hello. When I was a DR manager in Arizona, we worked a lot with Voc Rehab, with the students that were coming into the college and the services and so on that they got. And at the time, it was extremely restrictive with an order of selection that was down to level 1 only. Levels 2 and 3 never got on the list. So I'm interested in finding out if they are still using an order of selection, or if not, if they've transitioned to some kind of better funding process that people with disabilities can actually have a more expansive way of getting services.
Yeah. You know, Wink, I have to laugh a little bit, because one of the things about VR services is that they're provided differently in every state in the country.
Absolutely. They're consistently different.
So what's consistent is every state gets money based on their population to provide vocational rehabilitation services. But the words you just said, I have no idea what they mean. And I don't feel bad at all about saying, what is a DR manager, first of all?
Oh, it's disability resources.
Okay, so that was your role at the college or university?
Yes.
Okay. The level 1, level 2, and level 3?
The order of selection that Voc Rehab put out was, you're a qualified individual with a disability, and the people who were in level 1 were people who were immediately qualified. So people who were deaf or hard of hearing, or people who were blind or visually impaired, were automatically put into level 1 because their need was the highest, however they came up with that. Level 2 was either you have a disability that you have recuperated from or have gotten accustomed to the point of being able to either go to college or go to work, and your doctor has released you from care, puts you in level 2. If you're in level 1, it means you haven't been released from your doctor to go to work, and you're in this limbo ad infinitum.
Okay. I will tell you that we don't have levels like that in Oregon, to my knowledge, unless that's a relatively new thing. Yes, but I will also say that the Olmsted ruling, the Olmsted Supreme Court ruling, the Obama proclamation, and the court case in Oregon all would imply that those levels of readiness would have to be looked at again, because what the rehab counselors need to look at is what the individual's work readiness is, regardless of disability. So it's just an interesting system. And I do transition and AT workshops like this all over the country, and so there's always a question like this, because I'm familiar with the different state system, and it's just really, really important to know how your state does funding and does selection for both vocational rehabilitation services and developmental disability services.
I will say that from my experience in higher ed, and we're going back a bit, the early 2000s, that in working with the Voc Rehab for my students at the community college, it was about closures. It was then that I am counting numbers of people who I'm finding employment for, and it seemed like they often would pick the, for lack of a better word, those who were most ready so that they could move them to a position and move on.
You want to hear something economic about this whole thing? If you're on Social Security disability and you go back to work, you sign a return to work form, and Voc Rehab is the one who picks up the money for you. Mm-hmm. They get paid to put you back to work. Social Security takes whatever your release check is and gives it to Voc Rehab for putting you back to work.
Well, that used to be true.
It's not true anymore?
Well,
good.
Let's move on through this, because there are some ways, again, that's done differently in different states. And there is a new a new rule called the ABLE Act, which has an impact on that. So let's spend a little bit of time focusing on assistive technology, and then we will get to that part, particularly in the area of funding for assistive technology. I saw in the chat box there was a conversation about, whoops, I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button. I saw in the chat box there was a conversation about when to start focusing on transition services, and the chat sort of happened without me, but in fact somebody said, I think Gail's going to say that planning for assistive technology transition has to start in elementary school. And in fact, yes, I am going to say that. But let's get some background about why that is and what we might be planning in terms of assistive technology transitions and how to address those. So this is an assistive technology webinar. You all are an assistive technology group. I'm going to assume that you know that this definition, which comes out of IDEA, of an assistive technology device. It's important to know it. The definition talks about assistive technology being used to increase, maintain, or improve functional capabilities with a child with a disability. So this is a list of the functional capabilities that we often think about when we think about transition, or when we think about assistive technology. When we begin to think about transition, I want to encourage you to think about other kinds of functional capabilities. So when we begin to think about kids moving on from our public school or from our school services and into adult services, what we should be planning when we're planning those transitions is using assistive technology for increased levels of independence, using assistive technology to improve quality of life, increase productivity, and then at the very end of, I don't want to read you the whole list, but at the end of this whole list, to increase success and to reduce the amount of support needed. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about the Olmsted ruling was because what the Olmsted ruling and the Oregon class action suit imply is that those folks are going to be able to operate independently in more integrated employment and also more integrated living situations. So we want to think about our assistive technology not just for reading or hearing or seeing, but in terms of these kinds of functional capabilities to be able to do things more independently and with less support. Well, we'll talk about that some more. So let's go on to the next slide. In IDEA, there's this definition of assistive technology services, which you probably know by heart now. And this is the list of assistive technology services that are included in IDEA, but this is not an exclusive list. The definition of the service is any service which directly helps a child with a disability to use assistive technology. So this is a nice list, but it's not the only list. One of the things that's parallel but not the same in IDEA is that there is a definition of transition services. So I'm going to assume that because you came to a assistive technology webinar, that you may not be familiar or as familiar with this definition of transition services. And so I wanted to point out that transition services is a results-oriented process that's focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of a child with a disability to facilitate the transition. There's a lot of words there and lists of things that might be addressed, but basically it's a results-oriented process. Now, our special education services are also results-oriented processes, but one of the differences between transition services and IEP goal planning is that transition services may involve academic goals and a program of instruction, but they also may involve some activities that only happen once, or that may happen over time, things like job shadowing, things like filling out a job application, things like that, that aren't exactly the same as academic goals and programs of instruction, but provide kids with an opportunity to be ready when they make the transition. The other part of the definition of transition services is based on the individual child's need, taking into account strengths, preferences, and interests. So there's a very strong wording in the law about strengths, preferences, and interests, and it goes way beyond what I could put on this slide. In Oregon, the law is that transition services must be developed by the age of 16 or younger if appropriate, is what our Oregon statutes say, must be updated annually and have to include measurable post-secondary goals based on age-appropriate transition assessments. So those are words out of IDEA that tell us what we have to do and how we need to do it. I'm going to look at the chat box and see. Somebody says it's hard to convince elementary level instructors to think post-high school and adult independence. Just have to keep encouraging their involvement and know it will come if they hear it enough. That's true. I do have some ideas about how we might think about that, though, because some of the concepts about transition do carry over. But let's talk about Wink's question, because the next thing we want to talk about is some big ideas about AT and transition. In the transition law, it talks about post-secondary outcomes, and one of the things that I think we really have to think about is that thing that, who was that in the chat box? Sarah Lynn mentioned about we have to start thinking about it early, but it's sometimes hard to get people to think early enough. Another big idea about assistive technology that facilitates transitions at every level. So preschool to kindergarten, 5th grade to middle school, those kinds of transitions are independence in AT use. And those are things that we can start thinking about early on with assistive technology. And then finally, AT and self-determination. And there's been a lot of scrutiny and research about self-determination that we'll talk about in just a minute. Before we do that, though, a lot of times when people ask me to do transition workshops, they are hoping that I will tell them how to get devices for kids who are leaving school or how to transfer the technology. Each agency in our state and each state in the country, again, has different rules about funding for assistive technology, particularly at the adult level, about transfer of technology from school to, say, book rehab or to the individual when they leave school. They have different rules about sources of funding for devices and sources of funding for services. Now, I do think that transition teams should be addressing these topics. How do we get the technology so that the individual who's using a communication device in high school can move on and use that same communication device in their new job at whatever that deli was that you saw in the video a minute ago. But so one of the things that is, again, a relatively new piece of information is we're going to talk about the Oregon ABLE savings plans, but you should know that there are ABLE savings plans in every country, every state in the country. the thing is, again, they are administrated differently depending on the resources that are available and the way funding is allocated in that state. So in Oregon, individuals with a disability who have that disability before the age of 26, so basically people who are born with a disability, are eligible for an ABLE account. They can save up to $100,000 in an ABLE account without their assets, the savings, affecting their federal and state benefits. So Wink, that's where you mentioned that, you know, the money, the Social Security money goes away, the SDI money goes away because they might need something from a service agency. This protects those funds, and anyone who wants to can contribute up to $14,000 a year into an individual's ABLE account. The growth in that account, so if you make it an investment account, it's tax-free, and the individual doesn't have to pay taxes on the money that the interest might earn. It's a bit like a college savings plan in Oregon, the 529 plans that I contribute to for my granddaughters. And it actually is administered by the same agency. Let's go on. We've got one more slide about the ABLE accounts, and then here also is the link where you can find out more about ABLE accounts. Contributions to accounts in Oregon for beneficiaries under the age of 21 are tax deductible up to these amounts. So I can contribute to somebody's ABLE account and take that, have a tax deduction for doing it. Funds from an ABLE account can be used tax-free for qualified disability expenses such as health, education, housing, transportation, financial management, and assistive technology. So if you are leaving the public school setting and you have a high-tech communication device, this seems like another time to ask Deb, are there things in the chat box that I need to address? I can't see the chat, so tell me about it.
Well, I mentioned that one of the schools that I was working with back in St. Louis in the Lindbergh School District was starting portfolios at a very early age, and they were digital, and they built in pages for post-secondary and links for that, so that every time that you worked on the portfolio for that student, you saw the post-secondary piece, so it was kind of subliminal that you were always seeing that. And so several people asked, could I share that more information about that portfolio. It's not something that I've carried with me from Missouri. I will check and see what I can get and share it as a resource down the line. But it's just one way to make sure that if you can build it in, it's one way to make sure that people are going to see it every time they think of that student. So,
Cool.
yeah.
So
I'm going to try to find some resources for that. And I'm also working on the TIES conference. Any of you who are attending TIES, Therapy and Educational Settings, in April. And I'm looking to have someone who's an expert on the ABLE plan to come as a presenter, a speaker. And so if you want more information about the TIES conference, you can look at the website. We're talking about an OTAP presentation right now, but you'll also see ROSI, RSOI, a link to that, and you'll find information. But working on getting some funding experts there to talk about that piece.
we've talked about the legal and some of the new resources that are available in Oregon and across the country. Let's talk specifically about the three important aspects of transition planning, because these are the things that I think we can begin to think about early on I think from the first day we hand a child assistive technology. We're going to do that for two reasons. We're going to think about transition planning in the IEP to meet the IDEA requirements, but also because we know that if we think early about some of the skills that kids need to have when they graduate from, or when they leave our high school setting, that will help to ensure continuity of AT use in new environments. And some of that is based on research, and some of it is based on sort of extrapolation from some of the research about other topics. So let me take a step back and say that this is a chart from a book by David Buchman and Pat Miranda. That was their first augmentative communication book, and they talk about the factors that affect AT system use. And in their paradigm, they're talking about factors that affect augmentative communication use. But I truly believe that these factors affect any kind of assistive technology use. So individual needs and skills, opportunities to use the technology, the demands of the environment, the attitudes of peers and partners around them, and the kind of support that's available. We have lots of research about technology abandonment by people with disabilities that talks about how important all these factors are. But if you think about it, when kids move from a school environment to an adult environment, all of these things also change. So the factors that change at transition are identical to the factors that affect how well people use their AT systems. And I think that's really important to think about. And if we wanted to, one way we could approach the topic of transition is to look at each of these bullet point items and talk about how could we enhance kids' opportunities and use of assistive technology based on the kinds of things you see in this list. The only thing that doesn't change when a student moves from a high school setting to a post-secondary environment is the kid themselves, and also those parents who remain advocates for that student or for that person. So if parents are involved, if the student wants the parents involved over time, and again, that's one of the changes that happens is how much autonomy you have when you turn 18 and begin to use adult services. The only thing that doesn't change in this list is the student themselves. So I think it's really important to think about how we can help students develop the skills they need early on. And one of the projects that I got to be involved in the 90s was a project called Tech Trends, where we did research about what it took for students who used assistive technology successfully in high school to continue to use their assistive technology as well in adult environments. And what we found was that there were actually three things that made a huge difference about whether or not students continued to use their assistive technology after high school. One was how independent were they in the use of the assistive technology? So how much did they need other people to help them use the assistive technology? Had there been an instructional assistant in accompanying the child to classes and making sure that the augmentative communication device or the word processing tool that they were using was set up and ready for them, or were they able to do those things themselves? Another factor that we saw was self-determination skills. How much did the student themselves have the ability to take on responsibility for their own lives and their own progress? And then the third factor is transition planning in the IEP, which we've talked about a little bit, but we could talk about it for way longer if we wanted to, but we don't have that much time today. So let's talk about these other two areas because
Frida has a question for us before we go further. Frida's asking, was the amount of parent and family involvement and support expectation also playing a role? And I think you kind of alluded to that, but in this project that you're talking about.
We included parent involvement and family expectations actually in all three of these areas. What we wanted to look at was students who had been successfully using assistive technology in the school setting, and whether or not they had continued to use it 3 or 5 years later after they'd left school. So we actually identified kids who'd been using AT, most of it high-tech AT, in their public school settings, and then went back later to find out if they still were. One of the stories I remember about that and parent involvement was we went to the home of a young man who had used a pretty high-tech communication device and a head pointer in high school to attend regular classes. He had severe physical disabilities. He had been able to succeed in some regular classes and some modified classes, and he had a pretty good grasp of the use of the assistive technology and could use it pretty independently. But one of the things that happened for him was he lived in a not very good neighborhood, and when he got the assistive technology device of his own right before he left high school, his mom was afraid that they'd get robbed. So she actually hid the device so that people wouldn't come in and know they had this $5,000 thing in their house, so that they wouldn't be robbed. Now, that to me is a failure in all three of these areas. I mean, a failure of the school team in all three of these areas. He was pretty independent with his assistive technology, but he didn't have some of the self-determination skills he needed in order to say, look, Mom, I really need this thing to communicate. And he would have had to say it with the thing. But also, I think it was a failure in the transition planning process because parents weren't involved. She did not understand that even if they were robbed, she wasn't going to have to pay for that device. So we looked at a lot of things. These were the three main things that we found. But I will say that the parent involvement carries over in all of these areas. So Frida, I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, ask another one. So the first, what I want to do is look at each of these areas pretty quickly. And because I don't want to keep you late, but let's look at AT skills for independence. If a student is independent in using their assistive technology, they actually use it to do real stuff. So one of the things I see happening is that sometimes teams work with a student and they're working on speech and vocabulary development for augmented communication users. And then at some point, close to the beginning of high school, they say, you know, this kid hasn't learned to talk yet, so maybe they need a communication device. I really feel like that is an error in timing, because what we have to do by the time a student leaves us is to teach them to be able to complete everyday tasks and routines as independently as they can using the assistive technology. So they have to be pretty competent with assistive technology use. Janice Light is an augmentative communication specialist who does a lot of work with functional use of assistive technology, and she, as early as 1989, started talking about the skill areas that that people need to have in order to be independent with their augmentative communication or their assistive technology. So they have to have operational skills. They have to know how to make it work. And again, as independently as possible, because very few adults have an aide who follows them around and makes sure that device is turned on and programmed to say the right things or to do the right things. But they also have to have functional skills. They have to have skills that allow them to do the thing that the device was chosen for. So if you have students who are using assistive technology for written communication, for writing, can that student use that device to fill out a job application? Can that student use that writing tool to write their college entrance essay in their college application? Can they use that device in the functional ways that they will need to do it when they are adults? The other two areas that Janice talked about really struck me as ones that we don't always address. So strategic skills, the ability to decide when and where to use an assistive technology device. What do I have a broken leg right now, so sometimes I motivate, I move around my house on a knee scooter that I could show you a picture of if you wanted. But other times I say, oh, I'm going to a building where it's not very accessible and I have to go across a big parking lot, so I'm going to take a wheelchair with me. So that's an example of strategic skills. When and where do you use your AT, and when do you ask for help? And then finally, social skills, how to use AT around other people and advocate for your own use of AT. I've broken down some suggestions for all four of these skill areas on these next slides. And what I'm not going to read them to you. You have this handout and some of the kinds of ideas that might be useful to you. But what I want to talk about is on each of these lists, the first item is something very simple, very basic that we could probably teach almost anybody to do if they understand the function of the assistive technology. So turn it off and on. You saw a picture earlier of one of my supported employees using a paper shredder and all kinds of adaptive equipment. One of the things that we did for him was set it up so that it had a power strip on it, and all he had to do was tap the power strip to turn on everything, and it was all set up for him. But at a much higher level, if you see some of these other bullet points, troubleshooting simple problems, purchasing supplies for your own assistive technology, printer cartridges, things like that. So as we think about introducing assistive technology to students with disabilities, one of the things that we can do is to make sure that we are always thinking about what's the next thing this student needs to learn in the area of operation to be more independent. What's the next thing this student needs to learn in order to be more capable and complete tasks better in the area of functional skills? What's the next thing that the student needs to be able to do in the area of strategic skills? How do they decide when to use technology, when not to use technology, how to, when they need to ask for help, or when they might need to go to somebody like a voc rehab counselor and say, I need a new device. So those are strategic skills. How do you make device decisions? And then I'm going to show you quickly a video here because this is a self-determined young woman who has Down syndrome, and she's just so cute. We'll just take a couple minutes here because I don't want to have us be over time. This video was made for a college-level speech class, and she was learning to do public speaking. So this video is called "Don't Underestimate Me." Don't limit me, I'm sorry.
Hi, teachers in Douglas County School District. My name is Megan Baumgars, and I'm here to help you with your kids in your classrooms with a disability or without a disability. I am going to show you how to teach your students the right way.
Now, this is a young woman who has confidence. She's going to tell us all how to teach, but look at some of the things she's done with her life.
I am a special person. When I was in school, I made a lot of friends. I was in regular classes for support. I learned with other students in a regular classroom. I became a cheerleader in high school. I was the first cheerleader in the state with Down syndrome. My cheerleading team went to state, and we went on to nationals where we won our National Sportsmanship Award in Washington, D.C. Since I've been out of high school, I was a fashion model in a Global Down Syndrome Foundation fashion show, and I used to work at the Mile High Down Syndrome Association where I help them with events. I now go to the bridge program in Highlands Ranch where I'm learning how to be a public speaker. I have a lot of skills. I have a lot of dreams. What I want to say is to you, don't limit me. Don't limit me by thinking that I can't learn in your classroom. Don't limit me by thinking that I will always need someone to help me. Don't limit me by having low expectations for me. Include me in all your students in your circle of learning.
Okay, so if you want to, you can go ahead and you can Google "Don't Limit Me" on, or search for "Don't Limit Me" on YouTube. This is a YouTube video, and I think Megan is amazing. I want to meet her. So this is when we talk about personal aspects of self-determination. Sometimes we meet kids like this who just know that they have control, efficacy, and can control their own lives and make a difference in their own lives. But there are also skills that we can teach about self-determination. And Michael Waymeyer talks a lot about these skills of choice-making, decision-making, problem-solving, goal-setting, self-regulation and self-management, and self-advocacy and leadership. What I want to encourage you to think about, though, because we're focused on assistive technology, is how can we teach each of these skills that you see on this list and think about assistive technology. So how can we teach choice making about assistive technology? That one's pretty easy. But let's look at each of these skill areas and think about how could we teach skills related to assistive technology in each of these areas. Before we do that, I want to say that, again, the range of skills is enormous. So we might have some students who need a lot of help. You see lots of people around this student, and they're developing those skills independently. We might have other students who are independent and can do some of those things, many of those things on their own. And usually it's a range of things depending on the skill we're talking about. Deb, I see lots of items in the chat box. Is there anything I need to address?
We were just talking about, let's see, Wink mentioned that they do transition plans for the college students with disabilities going into careers. And I think, and I agreed, I said, I think we have to. to make sure that the planning is in place. And then I reminded her that we have a couple more webinars coming up that deal just with those things with assistive technology. And I think it was unanimous. Everyone agrees that our young cheerleader rocks and is very powerful. And you will probably see a spike in YouTube searches for her because they believe all kids should see that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I will keep on keeping on then. We're going to talk about these self-determination skills areas as they apply to assistive technology, and then go back just a little bit to transition planning before we end today's session. So choice making. Students who are self-determined can make their own choices about AT devices and services. So here you see a quote from Gordon, who was one of the students that we interviewed in the Tech Trans project. And he said to us, I don't wear my hearing aids to dances. One of the reasons he doesn't wear his hearing aids to dances is because the sound level in his high school dances is so high that it makes the hearing aids be very uncomfortable for him. And he said, I can feel the beat through my feet and dance just fine in that situation. But we can teach choice making. This is a skills sequence about teaching choice making that comes from a particular choice making program. This one's a little bit old, but actually the steps in choice making don't change a whole lot. So I use this as an example of one of the ways we can teach choice making early on. Okay. Another thing that we teach is decision making, and Waymar distinguishes between choice making, which is something I'm choosing right now in a short term, do I want hot dogs or hamburgers for dinner? Decisions are things that have long-term consequences. So decision making is often being involved in the decision about what assistive technology to use. Jason was a student whose voc rehab counselor really wanted him to use voice recognition for his computer input because he was paralyzed from the neck down. He actually used Morse code successfully, and he didn't want to change. So he had to have the skills to be able to justify that to his voc rehab counselor that his decision was the one that he wanted to live with. And this is a picture of Jason using his Morse code system. Those of you who know the technology will know that this is a pretty old picture of Jason, but the idea that he chose the system that he felt was the best for him is the significant one. People who are self-determined can solve AT problems. They can solve AT problems like Janice did, like talking to other people, involving other people in the decision. But also people who are self-determined can do some basic troubleshooting that goes back to that those operational skills that we talked about earlier. And so they can solve AT problems by either fixing them themselves, calling technical assistance at the company, or asking for help. Those would be three ways. And we can, again, there are plenty of curriculum for teaching problem solving that could also be applied to problem solving for assistive technology. So when you're talking about those elementary school teachers who think transition's way too far away, one of the things you can talk about is these kinds of self-determination skills have to begin early, because if we wait till high school to try and teach kids to be self-determined, they've already got a bad case of learned helplessness. They're waiting for somebody else to solve the problems for them, and it's harder to overcome that barrier. So one of the things I wanted to point out to you is that beginning problem solving is choice making. Beginning problem solving is knowing what thing you want to do in order to head the right direction for yourself. Students who are self-determined can set their own AT goals. Samuel was a student with Down syndrome, and he said, I learned about what I liked and what I don't like before I set my goals for after high school. They can set goals for what they want to learn about assistive technology. They can set goals about what they want to use their assistive technology for, things like that. Students who are self-determined can regulate and manage their own AT use. And this is a time for me to say that in that long-term transition study, the National Long-Term Transition Study that I referred to earlier, one of the things that they saw in the research was that it was sometimes much more difficult for students with autism to be self-determined. And I'll show you in a minute a slide that talks about some of the self-determination skills that were, self-determination assessments that were used in the study. But this idea of teaching students to know how to regulate and manage their own behavior, their own AT use, and to know how it affects the people around them was one that really had a huge impact on self-determination. And then finally, students who are self-determined can take a leadership role and advocate for their own quality of life. I think when we first say self-determination, sometimes we think about this and only this, that taking a leadership role and advocating for your own quality of life. But if you think about all the things that go into making for a student who can take a leadership role and advocate for themselves, it's all those other things that we've talked about. What we know is that we can teach self-determination, and when students have high self-determination, they're more likely to be employed, they're more likely to earn higher salaries, they're more likely to gain job benefits and vacation and sick leave and things like that. This is a list of 3 different self-determination assessments. All of them are available on the web at the links you see here, and they are free. The one that was used in the national study was this middle one from the ARC, and it's also the most complete of the studies. So that's self-determination. Now that we've talked about self-determination and independence of ATUs, which I talk about first because I think they are the things that we have to begin to think about first. And as I said before, the day we give a child assistive technology, we should at least be beginning to think about how can they be more independent and how can they have more self-determination and control over their own ATUs. Then we have to do good transition planning. IDEA says that planning has to have these characteristics, which we have talked about already, but also that we develop a coordinated set of activities to help them move through the transition process and be ready for adult life when they do move on. This is a list of the post-school activities that might be included in a student's transition plan for as required under IDEA. So these are words, again, out of the law, things that we might plan for, and might include these kinds of activities. So what are we going to say about instruction? What things does the student need to learn while they're in high school in order to be ready for transition? But also, what about related services after high school? How are you planning for those? How are we making sure that those are going to be available to the student if they need it to, for instance, reprogram a communication device when the vocabulary changes, things like that. These are the list of things that a good transition plan must address as proposed in IDEA, so I'm just going to leave you with that. And then to summarize, what I want to say is that just because a student uses assistive technology in high school and uses it well doesn't mean that they will continue to use it after the transition. So what I hope we do is at every age we begin to teach some of these skills we've talked about and develop a coordinated set of activities that will help also include a focus on the use of assistive technology for those students. I want to remind you that there are quality indicators for assistive technology that are available at quiet.org. And these are the transition indicators for assistive technology. This is a summary of them, but you can go to the Quiet website and find those indicators. And also I wanted to let you know, if you didn't know already, that there's a good transition planning worksheet on that Quiet website that's a resource for doing transition planning. I believe that we gave it to you as a handout today. And it addresses all three of these areas that we've been talking about. So assistive technology for independence, assistive technology self-determination, and good assistive technology planning as transitions happen. That's the other side of the worksheet. So I went a minute over by my clock. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm happy to take questions or address anything that happened in the chat box while I wasn't looking, Deb.
Well, Wink and I have something in common. We both have some higher ed experience with assistive technology, and she was talking about challenges in the college setting, having students who came to the college with nothing. And they partnered with some of the local state colleges to present some summer programs, some orientations, but they didn't do well because not because it wasn't a good idea, but because there was too much to learn all at once. And so it was kind of hard. And so anyway, someone else commented that said, awesome point, Wink, which we know. Wink's got lots of awesome points. She keeps hounding her teachers that they need to have kids using AT available at college before they get there. Too many things to learn in addition to AT when they get to college, and then they just drop it. And this is exactly the topic of a presentation I'm giving tomorrow at the statewide transition conference about helping students to really learn and integrate the tools in a setting in high school through a study skills format paired up with their other classes, but it helps them to learn not only what the tool is, but what they're going to do with it. So anyway, very important. If there are other questions, please feel free to put them out there. We will answer those either now or in addition down the line. But thank you so much, Gail. I know that when we think about boiling down what is education, well, education is to prepare people for what happens after their education and when the real life education begins. So it all includes access to and independence. So thanks for giving us some of these great ideas today.
Yeah, the conversation about college leads me to want to remind you that our next session will be about use of assistive technology in college settings and some of the things we know about assistive technology in college.
And that's on March the 16th, same time, same place.
Right, and I see that Sarah Lynn asked a question about, is there a way to get some idea of the range of AT options at college? But let me say just for now that colleges are not required to provide all the assistive technology that that a student might want in a college setting. So that's even a more important, we'll talk about it more next time, but that's even a more important reason to make sure that students have some good preparation before they go to college, because if they've been using Kurzweil in high school and the college provides Read and Write Gold, they're going to have to use what the college provides. If you're looking at a particular school, I think it's really important to go to that school as soon as possible and find out what assistive technology is available.